Today's topic, and welcome by the way, but today's topic is unit number 8, finances and distressed projects. A very important topic, like our other special topics are, very, very important. One that attorneys end up dealing with great regularity because associations need advice on these points. And it also involves assessment collection, which is a revenue generating source, a fee generating source for association attorneys. So let's think about this for just a moment. Where do common interest communities get their revenue from? In almost all cases, the answer is assessments, and that's it. And there are other sources, but usually it is regular assessments and special assessments. Regular assessments are supposed to be calibrated to cover your operating expenses and also an adequate contribution to the reserves of the association that are used to set aside for future repair and replacement of major building components. The dynamic there, the problem, is you're asking today's members to contribute money today, their money, to pay for future repairs that will be enjoyed by probably future owners. You may imagine that there is some unwillingness to do that. And so there's a real issue nationwide with under-reserved associations. When they don't have what they need, or when some other extraordinary expense comes along, they sometimes have recourse to special assessments. These are emergency assessments. And associations should try to avoid these. These are a real problem for members because they may be able to pay their $300, $400, $500 a month regular assessments, but where's the money going to come from if they have to come up with $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on short notice to pay a special assessment? And such things do happen, and these are real problems. So these should be avoided if at all possible, but I mean, a legitimate emergency is one thing that can happen, but not having the money set aside to pay for a roof that's been wearing out for years and then having to impose a $20,000 special assessment, that's bad management. Some associations might have investment income. They may have enough in reserves to actually generate a significant amount of money from their basically a savings account, so to speak. Other associations may have be able to get revenue from special fees or charges. Perhaps they have a golf course. Perhaps they have a restaurant, or perhaps they have a lake, something of that sort. Most associations don't, but some do. And then you have the question of loans from banks. So if you have this, say, this hypothetical bad roof, they may use a combination of whatever they have in reserves, a special assessment, and a bank loan to fix it. And those bank loans are not easy to obtain, and they are usually secured by the bank taking control of the association's assessment stream if the loan goes into default. So that means that it's risky business. If you're going to take out a loan like this, you have to realize that the bank essentially, if you can't pay it back, the bank will take control of the assessment function. Let's look at the scope of this and the significance of this for just a moment. So if we have 21% of the U.S. population living in common interest developments, you can see the scope of this. We're talking about over $5 trillion in property values, over 2 million people serving on association boards, 85 billion or more in annual assessments, 23 billion or more in reserve accounts. This is a big undertaking, and so, and attorneys are intimately involved in a lot of these decisions. So let's begin this with the budgeting process. And we'll talk about this briefly with respect to condos and also with respect to common interest communities. So this is the Illinois statute, and it is in most respects typical. This is Section 9 of the Condo Act. And as you can see, there is a lien. Each unit owner, including the developer, has to pay their share of the common expenses beginning with the first conveyance. So the duty to pay assessments commences with the first unit sale. And at that point, the developer, who owns all but one unit, has to start paying on all their units that they still own. Now, by the way, this is one reason for using phases and add-on condominiums, because this way developers don't have to pay assessments on all the units they intend to construct. They don't construct them all at once, sell one, and then pay assessments on all the others. I mean, that is what they have to do. So they will phase the project and use add-on condominiums so that they don't have to pay, let's say, on the entire 100 units they intend to build. They might put it in phases of 30 or 40 or 50. And the percentage share of assessments is the same as the percentage share of ownership in the common elements. The percentages are all set out in the declaration as we talked about earlier. Now the board is required to distribute to all the unit owners a detailed budget. Now understand that all the owners, let's assume that the units have been sold to the owners, all the owners pay their own proportionate share of the common expenses, which is the same as their percentage of ownership. All owners get the budget, they get it in advance of the meeting, and this is the thing I wanted to call your attention to. Section 9C. The budgets, of course, will cover the day-to-day or month-to-month expenses of the association. But the law says it shall also provide for, quote, reasonable reserves for capital expenditures and deferred maintenance for repair or replacement of the common elements. Now, that sounds good, except when you start reading the details. How do they go about deciding what is reasonable reserves? Well, there are several factors, 5 factors they're supposed to take into consideration. 1, the repair and replacement cost and the life of each of the building components. This is usually done calculated through a reserve study. Now, a reserve study, some states require reserve studies. Illinois does not. Reserve studies are typically, if they're done properly, they're done by a professional, a contractor, or somebody who really understands, how the building's put together and how long things will last and how much it'll cost to fix them. But the association directors can simply wander around the building and make these determinations on their own. So 1, they're supposed to consider repair and replacement costs. 2, any return on investment of their association funds. 3, any independent professional reserve study which the association may obtain. Note, they do not, in Illinois, they don't have to get one, but they should consider it if they have one. 4, the financial impact on unit owners and the market value of the units of any assessment increase. You see, so the association is actually allowed to think, well, gee, this, if we impose a special assessment, if we increase our reserve contribution, it will hit our owners pretty hard. They can also, the board can also consider how the marketability of the units would be affected by increased assessments that come from raising the reserve requirements. So this is a downward factor, a pressure that, mitigating against raising reserves. And lastly, the ability of the association to obtain financing or refinancing. Well, part of this relates to the fact that banks don't want to lend to associations that don't have any reserves. And that is a troubling factor. So you see, these are all things they can balance. But now look where this goes next. Notwithstanding those provisions, as long as the association documents do not require reserves, and some of them don't, if they don't require contributions to reserves, the association directors can waive reserve requirements entirely. It takes 2/3 vote of the association. And if they do that, they decide not to contribute anything to reserves, this has to be disclosed. And so when people do the disclosure under 22.1, it has to be disclosed they don't have any reserves. Now, any association professional will tell you that associations going without reserves are taking a terrible risk because they have an obligation to maintain and repair the common elements. Everything's eventually going to wear out. And when it does, there won't be any money there to do anything about it. And that means special assessment time. And that is going to lead to owners, in some cases, it could easily lead to them losing their homes because they can't pay the assessment. Now this is the section on lien. This is section G on liens. And I just wanted you to take note of this underlined language, that the lien for unpaid assessments includes interest, late charges, reasonable attorney's fees incurred enforcing the covenants. See? Now, so that means this is important because as an attorney, you need to understand when you're collecting assessments, you've got an ironclad, bulletproof lien to collect your attorney's fees for enforcing the governing documents. And that's pretty nice for the attorneys. They're guaranteed that they're going to get paid from by this owner, because they can't just pay the assessments that they owe and then extinguish the lien. To extinguish the lien, they have to pay all the collection charges, including the attorney's fees. Now, often the costs of collection are much higher than the unpaid assessments. There have been many, many cases where you had hundreds of dollars in unpaid assessments and thousands of dollars in collection charges, including attorney's fees. And this is a lien on the interest of the owner that is prior to all of the liens except the first mortgage. So this is a revenue generating thing for attorneys, but it's also very important because understand associations, I mean, their lifeblood is assessments. And if people don't pay their assessments, most of these associations have no other way of staying afloat. And if one owner doesn't pay, then it just increases the burden on all the others to pay all the common expenses. So that's why the provision for collecting attorney's fees and other things, that's why the legislature has made it, has given associations such a powerful tool to collect assessment. Now, if the unit is sold in the course of a foreclosure, and in Illinois we have only judicial foreclosure. I'll touch on that again in a minute. The purchaser in foreclosure acquires the duty to pay that unit's proportionate share of expenses from the first day of the month after the date of the sale. Also, the purchaser, as you can see in subsection 4, it becomes liable for the 6 months of unpaid assessments. This is important. The associations often end up in this undesirable position of having a lot of unpaid assessments when they at the time of the sale, and so they're guaranteed 6 months of unpaid assessments dating from the institution of the foreclosure action. And then here in subsection 5, you see all the various notice requirements that pertain to this type of action. Now, common interest communities, this is a section here, this is section 1-45 from the Common Interest Community Association Act. And some of these provisions are a bit the same. You see there's a notice of the budget, but this is a stripped down version here. The board is supposed to make it clear which portions were for reserves, capital expenditures, and etc. But you don't see the detailed allocation of or the detailed specification of the things to consider in the assessment of reserve contributions. It's really left to them to do this in a responsible manner. So really it falls to owners to be aware of and concerned about these things, and to their attorneys and property managers to make people aware of the need to reserve for future expenses. Also, in the case of both condos and associations, special assessments for emergencies are in some cases discretionary, and in some cases it might be mandated, such as to pay a judgment, and that can happen as well. Now let's talk a little bit more about collection of assessments. We talked about foreclosure. That's a pretty drastic remedy, and that's always available, you know. But in Illinois, as we discussed in the first week or two, delinquent assessments can also be collected using forcible detainer. In other words, you essentially evict the owner as if the owner were a tenant, and that is in the statutes, in the Code of Civil Procedure, and it is used with great regularity. It's much easier than a foreclosure action. In Illinois, well, let's talk about foreclosure. There are two types of foreclosure, and I'm sure some of you know how this works, but Um, we have judicial foreclosure states and non-judicial foreclosure states. In non-judicial foreclosure, it is possible for associations and other entities as well, but associations to foreclose without filing a lawsuit. That is non-judicial foreclosure. This is a fast process, and owners who don't understand that this is an option can be very surprised when they discover that they've lost their home before they even knew what was happening. Now, the states that are listed here have this procedure. I originally started practicing in California, where non-judicial foreclosure is the norm. I mean, when it's available, it's almost exclusively what associations use. And there have been abuses of that process over the years by attorneys. I mean, there are attorneys who specialize in the collection of overdue assessments. That is their practice. And they run these actions through as fast as possible. They run up the fees and costs. They charge certain amounts for every letter they send, every notice they supply, and then they collect everything, and it's secured by a lien. But then it can be quite harsh. But the advantage, of course, is that because it's faster, in theory at least, the cost to the owner, that is the attorney's fees and collection costs to the owner who eventually has to pay, is actually lower in non-judicial than in judicial, because the process is so much faster. And the theory behind non-judicial is that in almost all cases, there is no defense. There's nothing really to process as a lawsuit. That's the theory behind it, that there's no defense. That in almost all cases, you just didn't pay, and so why are you having a foreclosure action? Interestingly, we are in a judicial foreclosure state, and we are surrounded by others. Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Wisconsin are all judicial foreclosure states, so there has to be a civil lawsuit filed, and in order to foreclose, and it can take a long time. There are defenses and so forth, but in most HOA collection and condo collection cases, there really isn't any defense. I mean, in reality, there isn't one. There could be. It's not impossible, but and sometimes the assessment issues are folded in with other disputes. That is, there's a dispute over enforceability of another declaration term, or a dispute over one of their assessment practices, or over the way they enforce association rules. Now, let's get into, this is a subject that I think is really critical. We've talked about where the money comes from. And I want to talk about distressed projects, because this is an increasing problem. And lawyers need to know about this, because you could find yourself dealing with these issues, and you need to know what I would think, you need to know what the mechanics are. Both for counseling purposes and potentially for litigation purposes. Now, this first graph here. This is from Miami New Times, and this is this came out in late or mid 2017, and it shows that over the last 4 years, and now we are well outside the early years of the housing crash, but look at what has happened to the condo market. You see that the inventory is way up and sales are way down. Now, when this occurs, when condos don't sell, when the new units don't sell, it causes all sorts of problems, particularly for the owners who have already purchased. And so this has led to financial distress in thousands of condominiums across the country. And so let's discuss some of the issues behind distressed projects. This is a cartoon that came out during the crash. As you can see, on the left you see a man asking for money. Need money, I'm broke, lost my home, wife left me, please help. And on the right is a woman saying she needs HOA fees, she's broke, no reserves, being sued, please help. A lot of associations have gotten into and do get into financial difficulties, and when they do, what happens? Now let's go back to the primary risk factor. I've mentioned this early on, and I'd like to just repeat it. This whole institution depends on the resources of the owners, but most owners don't understand how it works and don't participate in association governance. So their only institutional support comes from professional vendors. And the fact is, as things stand, governments, like state governments, don't even know, in most cases, how many HOAs they have in their jurisdiction, or anything really about the state of their finances. So we as a society, state of Illinois, the U.S., we don't know much. We don't know what we probably should know about the finances of condominium and homeowner associations. And that is the core issue, is that the whole institution relies on the resources of the owners, their time and energy, income, their wealth, their judgment, and their loyalty. And so are they equal to the um, for lack of money, for lack of volunteers, for a whole lot of reasons, associations can actually fail. If the association fails, all the owners are really in a whole lot of trouble. And a lot of things can go wrong, and I want to talk with you mainly about reserves now, but understand, if people stop volunteering for the board, if the association as a government collapses, it doesn't have enough reserves, if they get into conflict, if they get judgments against them, excessive legal fees, many other things can cause them to get into trouble. And this can lead to demands that they be deconverted, so to speak, turned back into apartment buildings, apartment complexes. They can be essentially taken over. And this can cause a lot of problems for the owners. The owners themselves who remain end up, in some cases, bearing the financial cost that should have been borne by maybe twice or three times as many owners when others start walking away. And this causes all sorts of strange relationships and strange consequences. So I've been raising this question for years. Are we expecting more of the owners than they can deliver? That's a rhetorical question, but I think it's a really important one. And when you're counseling associations, you really need to address this issue. They need participation. Associations need participation and involvement, because that's where the money comes from. If people aren't invested in the association in terms of their time and energy and aren't willing to participate in running it, how could you possibly expect that the reserves would be adequate? And there's a funding paradox that's been pointed out. One is that, as I said, today's owners are being asked to pay for tomorrow's expenses, and so they may have the burden of paying, but not the benefit of paying. And so that is just inherent in this institution. We don't have, as I think I've shown you with looking at Section 9 of the Condo Act, we don't have adequate laws that require adequate funding of reserves. And in that situation, a lot of associations end up without enough money. So there's a big gap between what is expected and what is needed and what actually exists. These self-interested professionals are the only support. You would be among them if you become an attorney in this field. And so everything really depends on you. The local governments get benefits. They don't do anything. There's no legislative oversight to speak of. And associations don't always stay on an even keel forever. They have one election, a board that is irresponsible gets in power, and anything can happen. And so they can end up in conflict, litigation expenses, and so forth. So let's look at this graph. I think I showed you this before, but it's just a quick comparison of common interest housing in municipalities in terms of their financial support. Note that associations lack certain options that for financial support the municipalities have. Assessments are like taxes, that's true. Maybe they have some fees, but look, municipalities can issue tax-free municipal bonds. They can also get intergovernmental transfers and grants in aid that associations can't. As you will see, associations really can't go bankrupt very effectively. And whereas Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code allows municipalities to restructure their debt. There's no required training for association leaders, but the National League of Cities trains city managers and city council members all the time. They take them off to big seminars and teach them what to do. We've talked about the differentials in professional support, the lack of government oversight, associations. There's substantial oversight of municipality finances and behaviors. There's a lot more media and public scrutiny attention. And then we look at, this is the last thing, There is almost no data available, even for people, academics to analyze, for anyone to analyze, about the finances of associations. Is that true of municipalities? Absolutely not. All their budgets are public. Their actions are subject to public review. They're counted in the census as well. There's just a wealth of data available on public finances. So now that's why this is a problem, you see. So let's talk about what we're talking about here when we say common elements. In the case of a condominium, it's almost all the major building components: the roofs, the elevators, the decks, the windows, the plumbing and heating systems, basically the whole building except for the air spaces. In HOAs, it varies widely. In many cases, it involves private streets. Well, that is a real big ticket item to repair streets. And replacing streets when they wear out, this is a lot of money, particularly because private streets don't last as long as public streets. They aren't built as well. Construction vehicles coming in to finish off a project can pulverize the streets on the already built units. Then we have things like swimming pools and tennis courts and lakes and rec centers and sewer and water systems. These expenses can be absolutely enormous. Now, why should we doubt that reserves are generally sufficient? Why should you as an attorney address this question with your client associations? And why should you be advising any purchaser of a unit, any purchaser of a condo or HOA unit, to scrutinize the association finances very, very carefully before purchasing under that 22.1 disclosure? Why? Because they don't know how much to reserve unless they have a professional study done. Very few states require them. Many associations, if not most, don't even bother to do them. And nobody is making them do it, so they don't bother. And they really have no incentive to do this except good maintenance and good management. Now, developers always want to keep the original assessments low to facilitate sales. So generally speaking, at the time of turnover to the owners, there isn't enough money in the reserves. Then the owners control their level of assessments, and they're concerned about short term. They don't, in many cases, especially with condos, they don't even plan to live there more than a few years. So how can you convince them to allocate money to build a new roof in 10 years? And so it's very difficult. It's a very difficult task for the first owner board to raise assessments, and yet often they do. It's a very common thing for the first owner board to raise assessments because they just don't have enough money. And also there's no public disclosure except to buyers under contract, and there's no public oversight. So let's talk about a bit how this all played out when the housing market crashed. It hit community associations very hard. There were, at that time, vast numbers of converted apartment buildings that were old buildings. And in Chicago, there was just a tremendous stock of apartment buildings during the housing boom from 1995 to 2006. Huge numbers of apartment buildings, old buildings, were turned into condominium buildings. They're condos now. Well, a lot of those buildings had problems from day one because they were old. They looked new because they had new kitchen counters, but the buildings themselves were old. The housing prices were shooting up. Everybody thought, oh, this is a wonderful investment. And then when the prices started going back down, the whole market collapsed. Everybody tried to dump their condos. And there was a high rate of delinquency in assessments. Associations didn't have the money they were supposed to have. A lot of foreclosures by banks and empty units. And banks don't like to pay assessments on units that they have foreclosed on, even though they're supposed to. And so this creates problems for associations trying to collect from banks that won't even return their phone calls. Associations had a very hard time obtaining loans if they needed to borrow. Typically, if they had over more than 10% assessments in delinquency, they can't borrow money anyway. So this is one of the things that led to all these bans on renting and other things. And there's nobody around to bail out these associations. Now, this is fairly recent. These are some recent articles I wanted to show you. Kiplinger's did a story just a few months ago on the growing number of homeowners associations that are not financially sound. Association Reserves, which is a firm that does reserve studies, estimated that 70% of all association governed communities are underfunded in their reserves. What does this lead to? As I told you, large special assessments. You can't pay the assessment, what happens? You get a lien on your property. You can't pay off the lien, including collection costs, the association can foreclose on that for the value of that special assessment. So, recent story from the Washington Post. It's, as it explains, many older condo complexes, are mired in a recession that never ended. See, it may have ended for most people, but for many condo associations, they're still in a recession. Aging infrastructure, limited resources, and foreclosures is putting them in a deep financial hole. The monthly fees have gone up. Many owners then can't make the payments. They're trying to cover deferred maintenance, basic expenses. Some units are empty. And all kinds of bank practices that are really a problem have raised the number of vacant condos. And so the fees go down, the burden on existing owners go up, and you have problems. And these are some shots from some condos in the Washington, D.C. area. One association there, they closed the pool. They've got areas on the right there, you see that stairwell. I'll show you what it looks like under. They had to close the stairwell because it's falling apart and they can't afford to fix it. These are substantial repairs, obviously. Closing the tennis courts, etc. So there's different views on this. One person who runs a condo consulting firm says, well, some experts say that better oversight and tighter restrictions are not enough. And unless we have significant changes, increased funding, cities and states will be condemning and taking over the properties. Now that would be a logical outcome, wouldn't it? But, in other words, you have something that's turning into a blight on the whole community. Should government take it over? And then you have somebody from government, Montgomery County's Department of Housing and Community Affairs, saying, oh, well, that's possible, but he says we cannot, as a county, lend money to condo associations to fix their problems. The resources that local governments have are very limited, so who's going to pay for all this? Don't expect bailouts from local government, I think, is clearly the message. Another issue here is the governments themselves. I mentioned this earlier. The failure of the private government to finance things and to handle its finances properly. Here's an extreme example. In Las Vegas, beginning in 2013, there was a gigantic fraud ring that included at least 42 people. There were 42 convictions. There were other people involved. 11 HOAs were targeted for takeover by a ring of crooks who were some very prominent people in the HOA business in Las Vegas. They built these associations, and they took over these associations and built insurance companies out of at least $10 million, intending to go as high as $60 million when the FBI busted the fraud ring. That is Leon Benzer, who's doing, I believe, 15 years in prison for his role in leading it. Other people involved, prominent attorneys. I'm talking about attorneys who were very well known. Nancy Kwan was a very well known attorney in the Las Vegas area who handled HOA business. She committed suicide. So did another attorney, David Amesbury. Both of them were involved in this ring. They both committed suicide. The gentleman on the right is the former chair of the Nevada Republican Party, Steve Work. He got a year and a day in federal prison. There were also retired police officers involved, one who committed suicide. They essentially took over the associations through straw purchases and fake elections, rigged elections, and they built the associations and their insurance companies out of millions and millions of dollars. How can a thing like that happen? And the answer is a lot of these associations are not run properly, and some of the associations who guide them are not reliable people either. In case you're saying, well, it can't happen here, let me point out to you that it did happen here. From 2000 to 2007, there were hundreds, literally hundreds, of fraudulent condominium conversions here in the city of Chicago. They were used to commit large-scale mortgage fraud. The U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuted numerous cases, hundreds of defendants in Chicago and Rockford. We're talking at least 1,000 properties, and at least 300 million in potential losses, and that is an estimate from a year ago. It may be higher. This was an absolute outrage. What we here was that apartment owners would do all the paperwork to convert a building to condominium ownership. And they would do all this paperwork, but not put the existing tenants on notice of what they were doing. So they would do no renovations in reality. They would use photos from other building exteriors and interiors and advertising to make it look like they were rehabbing the building and turning it into a condominium. But they'd leave their low-income tenants in place. So they're still operating it as an apartment building. Then they would pay appraisers for fraudulent reports on the value of the units. They would sell the units to straw purchasers, and some were actually sold to investors, but a lot of them were sold to straw purchasers. The straw purchasers were paid thousands of dollars each. They would execute basically fake documents about their income, their employment, etc., to qualify for a mortgage loan. Mortgage company employees in some cases were part of the scheme. So the building owner would have this straw purchaser show up and quote, purchase the unit from the building owner and then would vanish. So the building owner is in on this. I mean, they're basically selling these units and defrauding a bank out of this. But the mortgage company isn't really being defrauded because they're selling the loan overnight. They were winking at all this in some cases. So this is part of what damaged the secondary market in mortgage securities so badly, because this is like a ring to bilk ultimately bondholders of mortgage-backed securities, although at the outset it's the mortgage companies. So we'd end up with a building that has no condo association, that has no owners, that is not paying its utilities, and turns into a slum, because essentially this crook who has converted the building to condominiums has taken all this money from these fake purchasers, and then they flee. And they take, in some cases, millions of dollars, and they disappear. And the people who, quote, purchased the units, they're gone too. They've taken their cash payment, they've left. The building is still being lived in by people who don't own, don't have leases. They're just low-income tenants. The utilities get turned off. There are, electrical lines being run from other buildings, people building fires inside to cook. I mean, this is what happened to some of these buildings. This came to the attention of the city attorney for the city corporation council, and because they kept getting, police would cite the buildings for building code violations. The Chicago Police Department has special units that do that. And this led to connections with an outfit called Community Investment Corporation. It's a not-for-profit lending institution for the city of Chicago. And their normal function is to try to package loans and rehab arrangements for apartment buildings. But they began to expand their work into condominiums when many of these fraudulently converted condos came to their attention through the city attorney's office. What the thought was, well, what can we do? Their job really is to help stabilize neighborhoods and take care of collapsing buildings. And in this case, they got into dealing with not just apartments, but condos. It involves the appointment, the judicial appointment of a receiver. So what happens is the city attorney goes to court. They seek the approval of the court to have a receiver appointed, which in many cases would be, in fact, the Community Investment Corporation, or it could be someone else. And they get all the title for all the units together. Meaning they acquire title to all the units, or unified title. And then they sell it to an apartment owner who then they arrange for a loan to rehab the building, put it in good working order, and turn it into an apartment building. So the judge ends up dissolving the condominium entirely and turning it into an apartment building. That is what happens to them. And this has been done with hundreds of condominium buildings so far. It is still going on. Now, going forward, if you're ever involved in the policy process or you want to understand what you're doing, what are the options here? And you'll see that some institutions, and this is very critical for the practice of this type of law, you need to understand what other institutions are already doing to protect themselves. We should be gathering more data on what's going on with association finances. We should be doing more education, alternative dispute resolution, etc. And at the federal level, Fannie Mae and FHA, they're already protecting themselves a bit. So let's see what they've been doing as well. First, here's the status of state laws. There are 19 states that have lien priority statutes. This is like what I talked about earlier, where 6 months of the assessments get lien priority. So the association will get paid in Illinois 6 months of their assessments before the bank gets their money. And this is very contentious. Of course, banks don't like it. But the thought among legislators was we've got to keep the associations going. If the association collapses, this is their only source of revenue, and they collapse, every owner suffers terribly. Only 10 states know how many common interest developments they even have. Only 8 require property managers to be licensed or certified. Only 6 require reserve studies. Only 4 have an ombudsperson office. What states collect data on association finances? 0. What states require public disclosure of financial information? 0, except for purchasers under contract. So you see, state law is not the place to look right now for protection. Hopefully that situation will improve. In my view, a model state statute would include an ombudsperson office that would have all these basic functions of gathering, disseminating data, oversight, education, and conflict resolution. You should have a lien priority statute that guarantees associations get a certain chunk of money out of foreclosures. Mandated reserve studies and standards for proper reserves, licensing of property managers, and comprehensive statutes for the operation of associations. These things would all be very, very good for the future of associations. It would keep them going, and it would make it much easier to represent them because you would not have to advise them and persuade them constantly to do things that actually you know, but they may not know, are necessary for their survival. So we've talked about some of this. I'm not going to repeat this, but basically we need to know, these are the kinds of things we need to know: the number of associations, the number of units, etc., the adequacy of reserve funds. Now, for associations, if they are in distress or potential financial distress, any attorney should advise them to collect assessments vigorously. You have to be aware, though, that it's complicated because if you push the owners too hard, you can push them into foreclosure, and then you have a bigger problem than you had before. You want the association members to pay their assessments, but you also want to keep them from walking away. Loans are a good source of revenue, but if the association is already in distress, it can be very hard to get. Insurance, we've talked about. Litigation, and by the way, the point on insurance is it's not going to cover wear and tear anyway. Some kind of storm damage perhaps, but not wear and tear. Litigation, should the developer be sued for underfunding reserves or construction defects? And then the last thing is bankruptcy, and we're going to touch on it in detail. But bankruptcy, many associations have tried to file for bankruptcy in recent years. It is very risky. Some of you may know bankruptcy law much better than I do, but I've read enough about this to understand, and I know what has happened so far. You have Chapter 7 and Chapter 11. Chapter 7 is risky because the association basically loses control over their own assessment process. And the same thing goes in Chapter 11 because in either case, there's a bottom line here, which is the protection of the, I said debtors, it should say creditors, that's a typographical error there. The creditors have to do at least as well under Chapter 7 as they do under Chapter 7 as they do under Chapter 11. So that what this means is that if associations try to go bankrupt, they essentially put their assets in the hands of the bankruptcy court. And they have tried to do this in a number of cases, thinking that they didn't have any assets or any significant assets. But they do. And the bankruptcy courts have ruled, and trial courts have ruled, that the ability of associations to collect assessments is one of their assets. And so that asset, the assessment power, falls into the hands of the bankruptcy court. And you can end up with a receiver controlling the assessment collection and collecting the assessments to satisfy a judgment. And this has happened in a number of cases where associations have not paid legal judgments. They lost a lawsuit over breach of contract or trade libel or something of that sort, uninsured losses. And they have found themselves they'd say, well, we won't pay this $5 million, $6 million, $7 million judgment. What happens? The court takes their assessment power and places it in the hands of a receiver who basically diverts the association's revenues, makes the owners pay the judgment, forces them to do it, steps into the shoes of the association board of directors and forces them to pay it. So bankruptcy is very risky. You could end up in the same position as these as a judgment creditor, or a judgment debtor. So you have to be very, very careful about this. Bankruptcy is a risky option. And associations have posed such a financial risk that a number of institutions are taking protective steps. Representing associations, you need to know about this. Banks have raised their standards for lending to HOAs. They are in court fighting, and in legislatures fighting, these super priority HOA assessment liens. That is the lien priority laws. The government-sponsored entities like Fannie Mae and FHA now don't just approve units and buyers, they approve associations. They rate or approve entire associations. And so that if the association doesn't meet certain criteria that I'm going to show you, then it affects every single owner when they try to sell their unit. States are protecting themselves in a sense by passing these statutes that I talked with you about deconversion, I should state and local governments. Some local governments are creating backup special districts in the event that an association fails. And developers in some states are using special districts as well. These are entities that have bonding power. Now, here's what I mean. Fannie Mae, in December of 2010, started changing their rules. And they said, we're going to rate the whole project. And if the whole project fails, then we're not going to buy any mortgage for any unit in the entire project. So they said they wanted owner occupancy of at least 51%. You see why some associations started banning renters. This became a real problem for a lot of associations. If they get too many renters, then that means that any mortgage that is issued on to buy a unit in that whole project, any unit, Fannie Mae will not purchase it. If Fannie Mae won't buy it, then banks don't want to lend. And so you could end up in a position, if you get too many renters, becoming ineligible for the secondary mortgage market, and that means you're probably going to have to sell your house to cash buyers. And so the additional rules, no more than 15% of the condo project units can be less than 30 days delinquent. You see why associations have to be careful about collecting assessments. No more, and some of these other criteria you can see, but look at this one. No more than 10% of the units can be owned by the same entity. Now this is a real problem if you have a lot of vacant units and a real estate syndicate comes in, or somebody comes in and buys a lot of the units. You can run afoul of Fannie Mae simply because you have too many units owned by one entity. And at least 10% of its income, its budget, set aside for replacement reserves. If you don't have that 10%, again, Fannie Mae won't buy the mortgage. FHA has similar requirements. The 10% of the units owned by one investor, 15%, only 15% can be in arrears in assessment collection. And again, you see that 50% requirement on renters. Bank loans, banks do similar things. You say, well, we'll borrow money from a bank. Well, you're going to find that the association has to pledge its assessment stream in order to get a loan. And they may have to also impose a special assessment. So you go to the bank to borrow money and they tell you, well, okay, number one, you have to impose a special assessment. Number two, we will take your assessment stream as security. And that's serious business. Because if you don't pay that loan, the owners will end up paying assessments directly to the bank. So typical bank criteria, again, for lending are somewhat similar. No more than 1/3 of units rented. A bank might take that position. Reserves not 10%, 20% of income. Delinquency rate less than 5%. See, this is even stricter than the GSEs. They may require professional management. They may not make a loan to a small association at all. They may want a professional reserve study that some associations don't even have, and so forth. And they want to know about your collection practices. I mean, they're not going to lend unless they know they're going to get paid back. So understand that associations are heavily dependent on their assessment revenues, and the failure to collect assessments is dangerous to their survival. And these practices that we've been talking about are really essential for an association to continue functioning. So be aware of GSE requirements, the proper budgeting procedures, and above all, the adequacy of reserve funds. These are all critical issues. I have a couple of things that I think you might want to read. One is The Uncertain Future of Community Associations, which is in your materials. Also a really good article by Trevor Pinkerton on what happens when associations go into bankruptcy and the dangers that I talked about of bankruptcy for associations.